I will call the policy committee to order, and first item is Pledge of Allegiance. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. Second item on the agenda is approval of the December 16th, 2021 minutes. So moved.
Second.
Anybody have any additions or deletions? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? And we have policies for first reading. I can't get my screen
Can
open.
you zoom it?
I've got too much stuff up here. I don't know where all this stuff is. Oh,
She opened it in Word, that's why.
Yeah.
First.
Oh, I opened the wrong one.
Yeah, you can do it.
Or publish one.
Okay, never mind. So I'm going to squint a lot. Policies for first reading are HO, staff job actions, unauthorized staff absences. This is re-lettering. It will now be policy HPA. Policy HOA, staff job actions, revisions and re-lettering, now HP. What would the revisions be in that one?
The revision is, if you look where it says unauthorized staff absences, that all was already in policy HO, which is now HPA. And
Okay.
it is a separate policy. I was just talking to Mr. Kamiri about, we follow, or we're attempting to follow the National School Board's lettering system, because when we have audits, they ask for policy by the lettering system, and oftentimes we have to search a great deal to find it, so we're trying to come into line with them. So that was repeated twice. It was in here, and then it was also in a separate policy, and so we're removing it and moving it in its own.
Okay, so it's in its own policy.
It is.
And I have a question on HPA.
Okay.
It says in HPA, and I know we have to go by what the state standard, what the wording is, but in this one it says any employee of the board. Well, technically there's only one employee of the board, that would be the superintendent, so it shouldn't be any employee of the district.
Well, the recommended legal language is any employee of the board, because you are the ultimate employer of everyone in district. Because you are the district, you're the overseers and the directors of the district. So everyone, their contract, you sign them. It's the board that signs all contracts.
Yeah, I just don't know, I'm just afraid where we discuss the superintendent and employee of the board, that it's in other policies or other areas differently. So that'd be contradiction, I don't know.
I mean, we can definitely, I can consult with Barrett, but technically every employee is an employee. It's not the superintendent that signs off on their contracts, you
Yes.
employ them. Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
absolutely.
Then we have policy IA, instructional goals, no changes. And policy IAA, instructional priority objectives, no changes.
I have a question on IAA.
Yeah.
It says the point of the district will maintain requirements of state minimum, but our practice is we'll do like 26 credits versus 20. The minimum is 20 credits for high school diploma. We have more days than the state minimum.
But we have to follow the state minimum. So we're required by state law, or ed rule, which is basically a reflection of law, to have a policy that states that we will follow the minimum requirements. So this means that we can ask above the requirements. We can say it's the Rochester policy to have 33 credits, but we can't let anyone have a diploma unless they have the minimum requirements.
Okay, so that's just a clarity for, we just have to have that policy in there. We can't say meet, maintain, or exceed.
And then you outline your credits in, gosh, I should
Yeah,
remember
there's
the
another
letters
policy
because we've
that-
talked about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, in the minimum, or in the diploma requirements, I think it's IF or IKF.
IKF.
There it is.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. So I think we need a motion to move this to the full board for first reading.
I have a question.
Okay? Yep.
Okay. Sandy, when you reference an RSA, is there a way that you could link that RSA?
I can link the RSA for you on your electronic document. I
That's what I
tried
mean.
to.
So when I'm looking at this,
Yeah.
like, to try to go find that, I'm assuming you have it readily available?
I
here.
do, yeah,
So
yeah.
it's like, you know what I mean, so when you email us these, just so that we
Sure.
can reference what that RSA is, or if we're referencing like you mentioned like a Barrett Christina kind of a, not this one, because I know
I
it's just a
can't
letter.
link you to the New Hampshire School Board policies because they're in a private database. I can print them out and give them to you, but you can't get access to them unless you have a login and password, and I don't have the authority to give that to you. But I can certainly copy them if you want a copy of a school board policy that we're
It's just hard to
reflecting.
reference something that we haven't seen, so
And
I would like it if possible.
yeah, and I mean, we can definitely link the RSA, and usually when we're making a change to a policy, as a matter of fact, we have one this evening, where there's been a change in the law, I try to put that change in the comment section, so you'll see where it says, in one of the policies coming up, we reference 193.13, and then I give you the language from that, so I can put a hyperlink in there, and then you can just, because it's hard to find the RSAs online, sometimes they'll say, oh, well,
I
this
was
is a link,
looking,
you
I was
can't
trying
get
to
to
look it
it.
up earlier. and it was
Yeah.
like- And I like the fact that you comment in there, but I'd also like to see the bigger picture,
Sure.
just to make sure that I'm understanding it, because I want to make sure that I'm, you know what I mean? So I just don't want to read like I think it's great that you add the comment, but I'd like to see the whole thing if possible,
Sure,
just
yeah.
so that I'm making sure that I'm reading it appropriately, and then,
I love the law book, so I'm happy to give you any copies.
thank you.
Absolutely.
That was it, sorry.
Okay, I'm still waiting on a motion.
A motion to send these for first reading to the board?
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay. Now we're on to policies for second reading. Policy DAF, Administration of Federal Grants, minor.
So I'd like to ask the committee to allow Sarah to also speak on some of the policies that are for second reading because she has the special education expertise. DAF, I can address the changes in that, but with your permission, I'd like her to.
Yes. I meant to say that at the beginning of the meeting, that this chair is favorable to anybody that's here on the board or staff to speak at our meeting.
Okay, thank you. So policy DAF is the federal grant requirement policy that you passed over the summer. And then we looked at three small changes in the federal statute that we were required to add, and we went over those last meeting. And I don't have anything additional to those, and those are outlined. And they should be in red, and that language is verbatim from the federal statute, which is hundreds of pages of very, very, very fine print. So basically, this policy is what we were told to have by the auditor when we had an audit finding this summer. We have been fortunate that we've never had that finding before because this requirement has been in statute for quite a long time. So we actually have taken, I'm not a lawyer by any means, so we have, on the advice of our attorney, adopted this policy as required by federal statute.
Yeah, I just have a question on DAF.
Sure.
Do we have a backstory of why, I'm gonna pronounce the name wrong, Hawaii, for lack of a better way of
I
pronouncing it?
don't.
Apparently they did something bad.
At first, I thought it was a typo, and I thought it was supposed to be Hawaii, like the state, and then
Yeah, and I
I
looked
said,
them up and they
no.
seem to be a telecommunications company and they sell devices. I just didn't know if there was any,
I don't know the backstory, but I bet it's significant to be able to be cited in this statute.
you say don't use them? Yes.
Don't use them. So there must have been, would be interesting to find out what that was. ZTE, did you Google ZTE Corporation?
I didn't, I just stopped at the.
I'll have to
owner
do that
line.
just for curiosity, but
It
I
looks like it's
don't
their
know.
own devices for some reason, so it must be, we can draw our own assumptions, but I didn't have anything that pointed it out, that's all.
It was something within the last year because it was just added, so.
Yeah.
Any other questions about DAF? We'll move on to policy JCA, change of school assignments, minor revision.
So this is it shouldn't say minor revision, this is a major revision because we had to redo the entire policy based on the updated manifest education hardship rules, which are actually more stringent than what the Department of Education rules were. And this is where I really rely on Sarah in these next three policies. But one of the big changes in this policy, in the manifest education hardship policy, is always in the past, private schools that had a religious affiliation were not permissible to have a change of school assignment to. They are now. So there's also, I think it's St. John's Berry Academy that's in Vermont. We can actually tuition students to out-of-state private schools now as well. So this does have a significant impact on school budgets because if a student requests to have a change of assignment for a hardship reason, you heard one a couple of years ago, we were very limited with that student on where, a superintendent would have to agree to take them. But private schools are pretty willing to accept those students, and that's a considerable difference in tuition between a private school and what we would pay to another public school. Yes.
What's it cost the district to send somebody out of district?
It depends on where they go. So if, for example, Bishop Brady High School in Concord is, I think it's over $20,000 now, whereas if we sent a student to Dover High School, it might be $13,000. If a student petitioned to go to St. Paul's, then we're looking at $30,000 to $40,000. So generally, the board would probably say, we don't find that, but it can be appealed to the state board. And where we sit right now with the State Board of Education, I'm not certain that they wouldn't uphold that.
Which is different than a special education day placement. So this is where the rules overlap. So the school Sandy's talking about is a reassignment to a public or private school versus a special education day placement. Yes?
So what about a kid that, for special education, he's gotta get pulled out of our district because we can't support what he or she needs?
That would be different than a manifest education hardship. That would go through the IEP special education process, and those placements can be over $300,000 per year.
We gotta take the,
Yes.
we take the hit?
Yes. And I can, if you'd like, when I give my presentation, I can just make a note and discuss that
Okay.
at that time a little bit, how the cost works for those.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
I noticed on G, it talked about special education placement, and I just want to be clear, if the IEP team determines that the student needs to go somewhere, this policy doesn't affect that, correct?
In item G, I'm sorry.
Yes, it does not affect that. So it's not deemed a change of school assignment.
Right, I just wanted to make sure.
Yes.
So when we're talking, so if a special ed student and the IEP team decides that that child needs to go to somewhere else, this policy would not supersede that. The IEP team would make that decision, and then nobody can break that decision. So
Right.
I just wanted to make sure that was kind of, if somebody at home is seeing this and they have a student that's special ed, I don't want them to worry, so.
Because IDA would be federal law. And so we implement the federal law through our state regulations. So they won't, this does not supersede that.
Perfect, thank you.
Any other questions? Policy JECB, admission of non-resident students, withdrawn and replaced with JFAB. So JFAB is the admission of non-resident students.
So in addition to the replacement, JECB was basically two policies written into one that couldn't go together. It was admission of non-resident students and tuition. And you don't want to intermingle those because that opens the district up to a huge financial liability. So they need to be separate issues. And Sarah can talk a little bit more about, there's also a section of the new adopted or soon-to-be adopted policy that discusses the share of special education costs. And
Sure. So to put it simply, special education costs are associated with the district of residence, where the child lives. So when a parent decides to tuition a child to another school district, the tuitioning school district has no responsibility for special education. We don't provide it. The school district of residence is responsible for offering placement. They're responsible for doing whatever their process is. We, as the district that's taking in this non-resident tuition, don't get involved in special education. in any form. And this becomes very important because it has very significant financial ramifications for the district, and it's often misunderstood. I think about 15 to 17 years ago, we used to say, oh, the other district will pay. The law is not that way, and this policy really very clearly states it out. When we take in a non-resident tuition child, we don't provide special education.
So last year, the board accepted a student from another school, actually for 2 years, that came to the high school. But in that agreement, it was very clear that while the student could come to Spalding, Spalding was not responsible for the cost of special education. So if that student needed special education services, it would be the responsibility of the sending school district.
Because we do have some programs that are placements within our school system, so we can take children from other districts, and that's separate from this. We have an agreement, we have a contract, it's signed that way, and there's a significant financial liability to that district. This is really when we think about parents going, oh, I'm gonna go to Exeter and tuition my child there. So same thing for Rochester. I'm from Exeter, I'm gonna put my child in Rochester. What's the obligation of the Rochester School District?
It's important that we have this policy now because the laws have changed so significantly with, we are not a free choice in education state, except that, you can move to a different district, or you can certainly tuition your student to a private school. But that the way that the law is written, we have more opportunity to accept students from other towns, and we want to make sure that if Ann comes to my district, that's great, but then all of a sudden, Ann also has a $300,000 special education out-of-district placement from us. It has to go back to her sending district. This district doesn't own the liability for that.
What happens when you cross state lines?
So
It's the same thing, it's our policy. So we would not provide special education barring a child being
Anyone.
placed in for anybody. If you are a non-resident tuition, you are expecting to not access special education.
If they were to be evaluated, would it be the sending district would have to send an employee to do the evaluation?
So our only obligation towards special education is to do two things. To call the resident, we have three actually. We have to notify the district that we've taken a non-resident tuition student, regardless of whether they're special ed, 504, it doesn't matter. Then if we feel that this child might have an educational disability, we have an obligation to contact that resident district and say, we want to make you aware of this. That's a child find obligation. And then we have to provide staff to attend a meeting. That is the extent of our obligations.
Not do the testing.
We have no obligation to test or anything there, because it's not like a charter school or a private school in our SAU. We're a public school district taking in these children.
So if special services were deemed needed, could they pay us to provide that service as a bill?
They could, but that would be a negotiated agreement between us and the school district, and honestly, unless it is a program like we have some at Spalding High School, it would not be in the best interest of the district to do so.
it's more liability.
More
Yeah, well,
liability.
can we clarify why it would not be in our bill?
It's a liability. Every time we provide a free and appropriate public education, special education to a child, we assume a liability. And when we think about we're providing a special education service to a student that's not ours, and they're not placed in one of our programs, there's a much greater liability. So if something goes wrong and we end up in a due process case, we're gonna own
Oh, okay.
that result. Or we have the potential, I should say, to own that
So
result.
if there's legal
Yes,
process afterwards, we're now
Yes.
legal bill that
Liable.
shouldn't be.
correct.
But they could send someone to here to provide those services.
If they wanted to do that and they wanted to work that out with their school district, that is between that district and the parents, and we will not be involved. But to say, you are welcome to utilize our school if that's what we decide.
Thank you.
Karen?
So does the same go for us? So if we had a parent that lives in Rochester that were to send their child to a private school, would we be obligated to offer special ed services?
So we have two different questions there. So one, if you're asking if I, as a parent, send my child to a private school, am I obligated to provide special ed services? The answer is no. When we send our child to a private school as parents, we waive that right for FAPE. Now there is a 504 obligation for that private school, but no special education obligation, so we don't have the obligation to do that. So by private school, I'm thinking of St. Johnsbury Academy, Phillips Exeter. Those are private schools, not a special education day placement. In terms of another public school, I can think of 4 public schools that take in non-resident tuition students, they have the same or very similar policies.
So so let's say I live in Rochester and I wanted to send my child to, I'm just going to use St. Elizabeth Seton because it's in Rochester. So Rochester would not be required to cover those special education costs?
That's a different question, because now we've gotten a little more. So special education has many layers, right?
Yep.
So if it's within Rochester and it's a private school that meets certain federal criteria, we have an obligation to provide under IDEA a certain amount of funding for a certain amount of services, but they're not a one-to-one for special education. It's under an individual service plan, so and it's limited in its scope and practice and what it's meaning to do. What we don't do for St. Elizabeth Seton is go, okay, my child went there, she has an IEP, she has reading 5 times a week for 90 minutes a day, this is the truth. We're going to provide someone to go do that service. No. When I send her to that private school, I've waived my obligation for FAPE. Her only services she's going to get is through an individual service plan that's limited by the amount of money I have to provide under the IDEA grant. Super complicated, I know, we can go back to it another time. But it's always a thinking about with special ed, where that school is located, and then what type of school it is. Charter schools are different. So there's all these kind of different nuances as we think about funding for special education.
I know it's going to be complicated and I'm hoping for a short answer. Does the same thing apply for homeschool? So if a parent
When you homeschool, you waive your right to FAPE.
Okay.
Which means, again, I can decide right now that I want to bring my daughter home. The school district's going to send me, I'm going to say I'm going to homeschool her, I send a letter in. They send me a written prior notice that says she's going into what we call child find. We provide nothing for her. You have waived your right for FAPE except for a triennial evaluation and the offer of placement that might come out of that.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Yes.
So, and you may have answered this, but in layman's terms, with the voucher system being proposed as far as crossing lines, how does this, and I know special ed had its own verbiage in that stuff, but
Well,
is this going to change or is this going to hold?
if the voucher system passes as written, it opens school districts up to an incredible amount of financial liabilities. Because the way that, and many people, when they were analyzing that bill that was proposed, that has been tabled.
Right.
So it is not a threat at the moment. Nobody went to the third paragraph where it said, your school district will be responsible for special education costs.
Right.
I think it was Nate Lunny that actually
Yes.
said, hey, you know, BA here in Portsmouth, and I'm seeing something on here, and the policy analysts that were discussing this at the state legislature said, oh yeah, there's no fiscal note. Usually when a bill goes before the legislature, they have to attach a fiscal note to say, this is the potential liability, even if they say the amount is indeterminable. They did not attach a fiscal note, did not require it, and basically told the body that was reading this bill for the first time, there's no cost. There's huge costs. There's huge costs.
There's huge costs
associated
because
with
it's
that.
also going to be, when we think about special education, the scope and size of a district determines the amount of resources we have in-house versus the amount of resources we'd have to take in, right? So I mentioned my daughter's IP. I think I calculated it out for another school district. If we went to that district, they would cost that district $40,000 to implement her IEP in the school. So it's really, it's very hard and it's very extensive when you think about what services look like in another system.
And I only bring it up because it's not a dead issue.
No, it's not dead by
it.
any
So-
means,
so,
yeah.
you
It's
know,
still there. And I'm really glad that you brought that up because I think when people read that bill at face value, it looks really good. But as the board that is overseeing the financial responsibilities of this district, when we talk about it or when we talk to our legislators that are voting on this, I don't think that there's a thorough understanding of the financial impact on school districts. And we did try to calculate, I'm on the legislative committee for the state, and we went through and we're calculating that out, you know, the potential without special ed costs is significant. When you add in what those special ed costs could be that we would no longer have control over, it could be astronomical.
Thank you.
Great question.
Yeah. We'll move on to JFAB-R, procedure for admission of non-resident students.
This is basically the legal tuition, non-resident tuition agreement. We haven't had one in the past. In Rochester, it's always been just kind of a letter and a handshake. And this is recommended by our attorneys to spell out who's responsible for what. So at the end of the day, it's not, well, I talked to Mrs. Harrington and she said, it's actually a signed legal document that tells everyone what their obligations are.
And it ties right to the policy. So there's no deviation from it. It does acknowledge that the parents have read the policy so they understand what they are potentially giving up by tuitioning their child to another public school.
Pretty heavy stuff.
Any questions? So if there are no questions, I would need a motion to move this to the full board for second reading and adoption.
Make a motion to move this to full board for second reading and adoption.
Second. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? We'll move on to public comment. Don't see any public here tonight. We close public comment. Any other for policy?
I have one other. I was not able to be present at your meeting, but I did watch the meeting, and there was a question on our bullying policy.
Yeah.
So I included it in your Google Drive, and Mrs. Stokes, I did include the RSA in there as well, the 193.3.
Is it?
193F.
I'm not seeing it in our packet.
It should be in your drive.
Shared for the policy committee.
I'm in the policy today, I'm still not.
Where is it under? In the shared
The
drive.
last one I have on the bottom is JFAB-R.
I've got JICK and backup. Policy 2021,
Oh, it's under policy.
2022. Should back up.
Is it under a different?
Did you go into the shared drives
Policy,
and then policy?
2021, 2022,
JIC.
This is the
No,
last one.
not in this.
The JIC and backup.
JICK.
JIC.
Scroll down on
Oh, here.
that. Yeah. Those are the first three letters on the report.
All right.
So I just wanted to clarify, because I know there were some questions. The bullying policy is an exact reflection of the law. It is specifically, there's components specifically within the law that are required for us to be put into a policy by education rule. So anything that's in here, and this policy actually, if you look at it, it cites which section of the law that, because it is so incredibly specific, including any timelines and procedures. So I wanted to make sure that you had both the policy and the law so that you could, as you're reading it, you could see where it says, 193F3, and then you can look down, 193F3 are the definitions, and the definitions are verbatim. And the statements that are required is RSA 193F4, 2A. I also included in your backup the Department of Education's page on, we use this often in our schools, and it has a link to bullying reports. We are required to provide a bullying report to the Department of Education every year of how many cases that we had that were substantiated, and those are all hyperlinked on that report. It also talks about the law, the duty to report, and RSA 193, and then on the third page, it lists resources that our schools often use and our guidance departments often use to work with students on strategies and knowledge of bullying. I did verify with each of our principals that the policy and is in their handbook, and the policy is linked to their webpage, that they go over it with their staff at the beginning of every year, and that they are using these resources to educate their students in their school. I also asked how many cases that they've had this year, because I know that that was a question. At the elementary level, there's been 6 substantiated cases this year, 3 of which were questionable, but erred on the side of caution. There have been 3 cases at the middle school. and I did not get a report from the high school, but I have not received, as you know, do the discipline committees, and any extended discipline that we've had has not been related to bullying. So I can certainly, it's not really a policy question if you're interested in how it's implemented, because the policy is basically the law and we don't have the option of changing that or not following it. But if you had any questions on implementation, I could certainly ask principals to come maybe to special services or to, I think it would probably be special services as opposed to instruction. But I'm sure that they'd be happy to talk about how it's implemented in their schools. It's just not really a policy issue, it's more of an implementation in practice.
Just a point.
Yes.
When they go over, and I think it's a good idea, when we get to that committee to make that official, but it'd be good to not only, this is what we're doing, what are the challenges they're facing? I know it's a new policy that they're adopting, so there's a learning curve we have to be adjusted by.
This isn't a new policy.
Well, isn't
It's
the
been-
discipline, oh, sorry, I was getting this confused with discipline.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Yeah, this has been in place for quite some time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you said 6 at where? At the middle school or the?
At the elementary level.
Okay. So, I don't expect you to know these questions, but I just have a couple. So we're getting phone calls, I've gotten a couple, and it's just weird if we've only had 9. So I guess for me, what I'd like to see from the policy is there's gonna be more complaints than the 9. So we investigate it, and I think I'd like to know that process. Because if we're getting
It's
phone
in
calls.
here. The process for investigating the bullying complaints is in here. And oftentimes, and this happened, I don't know if you remember back to 2000, I say it was 2010, but it might have been 9, when the bullying law was first passed. A lot of people, Sarah didn't get invited to the birthday party. Everyone else in the classroom got an invitation, but Sarah didn't. That's bullying. It's not bullying. It's mean, but it's not bullying. Bullying, and if you look at the definitions as well as on the paper that was provided from the Department of Ed, there's a balance, an imbalance of power, perceived or real imbalance of power. It could be a significant event or it could be a pattern of events. But generally, a lot of people will say, they'll call and they'll say, my child is being bullied. Someone is being mean to your child. It's not necessarily bullying, and it's an opportunity for us to have an educational intervention. If it continues and becomes a pattern of behavior, then it becomes a bullying issue. But usually after that intervention, it subsides. And then the other thing that will often happen is if someone says, Sarah's bullying me, and then I call, because within 24 hours you need to call and notify all parties. There's been a complaint of bullying. You notify both the perpetrator and the victim. The perpetrator will often then say, well, my child's being bullied. And pretty soon you have 6 kids that you're now investigating for bullying. And then it often turns out that it's not, in fact, bullying. It's mean behavior on the playground, but it's not bullying. But what you hear is bullying.
Do you know, can I ask another question? Okay. Do you know how many get reported? Like, I know that there's 6 confirmed. Do you know how many get reported at each school that are not considered bullying?
How many referrals that we'd have to, I don't even know if guidance counselors would keep a record. I don't know if anyone that's worked in an elementary or even a middle school knows, and you probably know, Karen, because I think you work in a school.
I do.
That kids, behaviors at school.
Even if we got like an app, you know what I mean? Like
I couldn't begin to give you that, but if you invite the principals back for a discussion on referrals, they probably can help you more.
So like Karen said, we're receiving phone calls about bullying.
Yeah.
You said there was 0 cases in the high school?
No, there have been, no bullying cases have come to me from the high school. I don't know that they've not investigated cases. I do know there was one case where, and I can't really divulge a lot of information, but there was a number of students involved and they had to, the principal can ask for a 7-day delay, and it's because the students were all suspended. And then the investigation was conducted after, and I don't know that that's been concluded yet.
So what was reported to me was there was one person being, for whatever Sarah was going, I don't want to go into details, but
Mhm.
by multiple different students, and a no contact order was put into place.
Yep.
So can you just explain what that no contact order, like,
So,
what
and-
happens if they do anything?
I don't know, we might be talking about the same situation, but I'm not positive. So when a no contact order, it's kind of like a restraining order. In the school, yeah, so I will say to Sarah, you are not allowed to go in, hallway E, or you're not allowed to have any contact with Sarah. Sometimes the way the schedule happens, they might have to be in the same class. It might be impossible unless the victim wants to move out of that class. But if it's a single class that's required and that's their only opportunity, then they have to sit across. They're not allowed to have any contact with each other. It basically means it's no contact. And if they violate the no contact, then they have to go back through that discipline process that's likely suspended. And in the situation, if we're talking about the same one, there was a suspension, a long-term suspension. And it was if they came back for an additional, then they had already had the maximum, so they would have to have the maximum, and then we would have to call an attorney because they would be over the mark, so.
Now, to put somebody on a no contact order, is there something before that, some kind of consequences they had before they got put on that, like suspension?
Yeah, it would depend on the
something?
severity. In this particular case, the one event was very significant and severe, so it was immediate. That there was a significant discipline process, there was a significant consequence, and then upon return, there's a significant no contact order.
Okay.
Yeah. But because my son does the same work that you do. Just because you give someone a restraining order doesn't mean they're gonna follow it. It's, so then we have to follow the process if they don't. Sandy?
Yeah, thank you. It's all new to me, and I apologize if it's a stupid question or whatever.
Never
but
a stupid
I
question.
noticed it specifically references to school property. What if you have a child leaving and going into the Pines to get to North Main Street? Is that?
If something happens off school property, the only way that it can be dealt with by the school is if it impacts the educational process or the education of that student that's being bullied. So if you're at Dunkin' Donuts on the weekend, Sarah is relentlessly bullying you, so much that you don't want to come to school. Now that's impacting your education and it becomes a bullying issue for the school.
Oh, good, okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So just the reporting for like, if the bullying occurs on a bus or whatnot, especially if mixed bus between middle school, high school, or grade school mixed parties. So, same process, the victim would report to their principal, and then...
It could be that, or we did have a case this year that crossed middle high school.
Yeah.
So it was actually reported by the parent, which was immediately brought to the principal, the 4 administrators at the high school and the administrators at the middle school, because they all shared the students, and then we facilitated that process. There was a resolution where, students were moved around accordingly, and then that went from there. But it would involve, if it were to come to me, if it came to you and you called me and told the parent, please reach out to the school principal, but you also let me know, then I could reach out, which is what happened. I reached out to the school principals and said, okay, these are the kids, this is what we need to do. And I think that was resolved within, Mrs. Perkins, I don't know if you remember, but I would say probably within a day. We put an immediate stop plan in so that while it was being investigated, we knew that there was safety for all involved. And then it was resolved.
And to kind of piggyback on Sandy's question, the bus stops constitute school property?
So the school day starts for the student when they step onto the bus, and it ends when they step off of the bus. So if something happens at the bus stop after the bus leaves, or after the students step off the bus, it's technically not school day. However, if whatever happens impacts the school day or the student's day, then it becomes a school issue, as well as a legal issue. And oftentimes, cyberbullying is probably one of the biggest things, so we always encourage families to involve the police department as well. Karen?
And I apologize, I did not see this policy, so I want to read it. But it says, under investigative procedures, and it keeps talking about the principal. So the only person that can investigate, unless they're closely involved, is the principal.
The principal or their designee.
So in this policy, I'm not seeing where it says, or their designee. So I don't know if that needs to be changed in the policy, but under X1, it doesn't say. It says, upon receipt of report of bullying, the principal shall within 5 days initiate investigation into the alleged act. If the principal is directly and personally involved with a complaint or closely related to a party, the superintendent shall direct another district. So if it is somebody that's other than principal, we might want to make sure.
I think that we do a letter at the beginning of the year that designates who, and that's a different policy where the superintendent can designate who is able to administer and run discipline practices. I can't remember which policy it is. It's driving me crazy right now. So, for example, if Mrs. Zolman was filling in at an elementary school, if there was a bullying incident or a discipline issue, even though she's a certified principal, if she didn't have that letter authorizing her to investigate or take action, she wouldn't be able to do that. Mrs. Turgeon, like at Chamberlain Street School, Ms. Turgeon, Mr. Gray, at the middle school, it's the 3 administrators that are, I can't remember the new one's last name, but Randall, Ms. Green, and Mr. Houghton, and that is all done. It's not in this policy, it's a different policy where the school board designates the superintendent, and the superintendent can designate. I just did that policy, what was it?
Should we reference that policy in this one? If
I
they're
don't think it
closely
should be
related?
referenced.
This
but I
policy
feel
is-
like Or designee.
I mean, because if I'm looking at this, and I'm a parent reading this, it sounds like it's just the principal. So if there's another policy that says it's a different person.
The principal will sign off on it. So, I mean, again, this is something that I can ask our legal representation about, but this policy is the law. So if we contact them and they okay that, that's, yes.
Karen's point, I guess, to the point, if it's a law, the law states the principal shall, then the law is saying that only the principal can handle this unless the principal's not involved. That's what the law says.
But I
If
think.
practice is different, then we would have to have legal counsel to determine.
Yeah, we can do that, but I think it's the other policy where the principal, where you give the principal the right to designate, so, but I can ask, I can certainly check.
Or maybe if we can reference, as Karen said,
Well, yeah,
the
the
other
principal
policy.
can.
I don't know what's referenced at the very
just
end of
to
this.
the point that was made, as I dealt with one parent at one time,
Yeah,
it's like, you can read the policy, but I said, call the administration, they'll review it. If they're handling them this policy, referencing it, and this is the only thing they're reading, they're gonna say, well, why is it an assistant principal?
Yeah.
Why is it whoever? And people unfortunately are very literal nowadays,
yeah,
and they
absolutely.
will come after, well, you didn't give me, okay, I can, but
This
let's
says
make our
that
life easier, that's all.
the principal shall initiate investigation. Doesn't that mean the principal has the right to use someone else?
I'm just looking at the actual,
Could be implied that way.
I mean,
two.
It's all for
they
interpretation,
initiate
right?
it, they say, you take the lead on this and you do it. So if we have a letter at the beginning of the year that there's a person at each school,
Yeah, the law just says, references F, right, 2F?
Well, internal reporting, principal or designee shall be responsible.
right, and designee is
Where
inferred
does it
in
say
other
that?
parts of
Where
the
does
law.
DEII, Roman numeral
The
8.
reporting part
Procedure
is
for
the
internal
designee.
reporting requirements. In order to satisfy the reporting requirements of RSA 193-F:6,
6.
principal or designee shall be responsible for completing all New Hampshire Department of Education forms and reporting documents.
Yeah,
So
that-
it well, I'm just saying, it principal or designee is referenced in that for reporting to the,
So I also think I read, can I ask another question? I think I read on here that this copy gets sent to parents. Do we give the one that you're referencing to parents as well, saying this could be the designee?
Yeah, actually, as a matter of fact, we do. They're all in the student handbook.
Okay.
And that's how they're distributed to parents. In addition, I believe at some of the school districts, they actually list the policies separate as well, but they're all in the student handbook that goes home. Any behavior policies are in that handbook. I think it might be JICD, as I'm thinking about it, but it's in there. And that policy was new this year that talked about the new behavioral
I guess my only thing is if we're questioning what policy it is and parents don't understand the policies as much, I mean, it wouldn't hurt to either reference it or say their designee and, you know what I mean? It's
I
not gonna
hope that
harm it
they
if we
look
put it
at
in
the
there.
handbook. I mean, and if someone asks you where a policy is about behavior, please, refer them to the central office and we can answer that question. And always ask them to check their handbook too, because behavior policies are outlined in the handbook. All expectations are in the handbook and how we, and our operating procedures for those policies that are in the policy are there as well. And that's required by law. They always were in there, it's just the new policy, the new behavior policy is pretty explicit as basically a regurgitation of the law, which is not always easy to understand, but that is in the handbooks as well.
Yeah, JICD-R is the due process procedures, and it says superintendent or his or her written designee is authorized.
Thank you.
Yes.
I just would ask that you seek legal counsel, because if it's referenced or designated in one area, it should be consistent then, and informed. Consistency throughout the policy should be consistent across the board.
Yeah, we can, absolutely.
Let's just verify.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we can't change the law, and this is the verbatim the law.
Yeah, but usually if it's law, if you're it's clarify, you're right.
We can't.
And if that's the case, then are we practicing it properly if?
Right, should it only be principal?
Well, when you're looking at investigative procedures, number 5 states factors the principal or other investigator may consider. So they realize that the principal may designate someone else to do the investigation.
I guess my question is, Karen, are you questioning whether the report would go, the reporting of the bullying would go to the principal or somebody else, or the investigation part is the principal or somebody else?
So I guess by reading it, I think our principals have a lot to do. So my question originally was, how many reports do we get? I mean, if you're getting, and I could see this, getting 5 potential reports a day. And the
Oh
principal,
gosh, that's not happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, let's
Yeah.
say it's even 5 a week. Is it the principals, like, do we want the principal dealing with those, or do we want to designate? And according to the law, I guess my question is, if this is reading what the law says, and the law says it's the principal, then how do we have another form that says a principal or it's a designee? I'm fine with it being a designee. I just think if we're saying this is written by the law, and the law says the principal, then it should be the principal. If JICD says the principal or it's a designee, if that's fine by the law, the two should align together. So whatever the law says, the two of them should be, so either we need to change JICD to just the principal, or we need to change JICK. So whichever one is the correct writing of the law, they both need to align. Because when you're a parent reading a policy, it would be really feasible for that parent to just be able to read it and say, or designate.
So Karen, not to interrupt you,
Yeah.
but, and I'm sure anyone that's read the education law book, which is about this thick,
Yeah.
which I'm very fond of, there are several, as you go through that, you will find several laws conflict with each other. They're written in different ways. That if this were to go to a court, they would look at the intention of the law. JICD-R and JICD are a regurgitation of that law that's referenced. This is a regurgitation of this law that's referenced. The court, I guess, would have to decide if JICD-R, where it specifically says that it can be the superintendent or designee or principal or designee, would allow the assistant principal to conduct an investigation. That authority has been granted through you, through the superintendent, through the principal to that person, so I believe that would be upheld. I don't have the power to change the law, but we can certainly consult with our legal counsel to see if it's okay to add designee to our policy.
Yeah, again, I just think both should align. So I don't care which way it goes, I just think they should align.
So we'll check into that and see if that's okay to do.
Yeah.
Or even if it's necessary, because I find in several places in this law, it says designate. Or the principal shall institute an investigation. Whatever that takes to institute an investigation. It doesn't say the principal shall do the investigation.
Well, number 6 says the principal shall complete the investigation.
I think it would be best to, because we could debate the wording of the law all night and we have no power over it, so let's get a legal opinion. I want you, every time you ask me to get a legal opinion, I want you to know that there's a bill attached to that, so I don't want you to get legal bills and say, why is she calling the attorney for these things,
They're
so.
gonna ask you that question.
Yeah, there is, and they charge us by 15 minutes. So if I talk to them for 5, it's billed as 15, so, and then they'll have to look into that and get back to us. So I just want to make sure that that's what you're instructing me to do before I do it.
That's terrible.
I know,
It's reality.
That's ridiculous.
we're in the wrong profession, my
Lawyers.
friends.
Well, they went to school to be
Yeah.
employed as a legal person, and that's how they make their living.
When you need them, they want from everybody.
So,
When you have
yes,
country of laws. I don't think this committee has the ability to ask for legal opinions. I think that needs to go to the full board.
I'm going to make a motion that we go to the full board on GICK to ask for legal counsel on the verbiage.
Or consistency with the term, or the word or designate can be added to the policy.
Yeah, so I would make that motion.
So, all those in favor?
Aye.
I've got a question.
Discussion? Yes?
Yes. According to this item 4 under Roman 7, I guess, the administration is supposed to have a policy, system for reporting anonymously. Have we thought about that, and do we have a system?
I did ask, I have a copy of the message that I got. They do have systems, and specifically, there was one principal that outlined his system for me, and it was at Chamberlain. I don't have it here. But again, that would be something if you invited them, the principals back, they could talk about what their procedures were. They're probably different at each school for however they handle that, depending on who they have for personnel, if they have a guidance counselor, if they have a social worker. But they do have a mechanism to make that happen at their school, where
Throughout
it
the
can
system.
be anonymous.
They may be different, but they're at every school? Is that what you're
Yes,
saying?
but it could be different depending on
Yeah.
what they have for
Okay.
personnel.
Okay.
But that would be a great question to ask them to share with you. Absolutely.
Are we inviting the principals and the designee for another paper, or just the principal?
I guess it depends on how many people that you want, how long you want your meeting to be. I would probably recommend inviting the principal to come and share
Yeah,
information.
I don't think they need to bring.
And again, this would not be part of the policy committee. I just want to, I want to try to bring us back that this is a policy meeting and we're questioning the policy. We're not really talking about how the policy is implemented would be really at a different meeting.
Which
Okay,
meeting would that be?
I'm going to call a vote on the previous question, whether you think we should take this to the legal request, legal information request to the full board. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
So this will be your second reading, and when you have your second reading of this policy, or I'm sorry, this would not be your second reading, this is an other, so
This
it would
is
go
other,
as other, yeah.
So
Thank
do we
you.
need to table it?
No, we're just waiting for permission, and then if the board approves it, then Sandy can act on it. and report back to the
This
next
policy isn't up for review by the board right now. We're just,
So it's not first reading, right?
it's not first reading or second reading. It's just we were interested in this policy.
meeting. She reacted based off of
It's under
what's
other.
left.
Yes, we're under other. Anything else on bullying? Anything else under other? I'd like to move that we adjourn. All those in favor?
Aye.